working on this project, a project I call Maiden in the Tower. Maiden in the Tower is number 310 in the storytelling type index. It's probably known best by its by the Grimm version, Rapunzel. Rapunzel's a terrible version of Maiden in the Tower, although some people like it. You know, I don't want to hurt any feelings. But actually, Rapunzel is the end result of several literary versions transferring through a couple of hundred years, and eventually gets picked up by the Grimm brothers, who have no idea what they're handling. They think it's an old German folk tale because they use the word Rapunzel in it. Rapunzel, by the way, is a vegetable that grows in German gardens, so therefore any story that is about Rapunzel must be thousands of years old there in Germany, when in fact the story came from Naples to France, taken over to Germany about 100 years before the Grimm brothers got their hands on it. And it was taken by a man who said, "Parsley? Germans don't have parsley, we use Rapunzel." And that's where it got its name. Most Americans don't know any of this because they're mostly listening to Rapunzel. That's how it's translated, because our translators don't translate first names. So you didn't get to know that she was a little girl with lettuce. Hey, lettuce, let down your hair. Anyway, all this to say, when I was asked if I could do a Maiden in a Tower story, I went back to Naples and I found all the little elements of the stories that they had there. There were actually 3 versions around the 1500s. And those 3 versions were very, very different than the Rapunzel we have today, except they all are the Maiden in the Tower. Some woman is pregnant, she goes into the next door neighbor's garden to get a vegetable, which turns out to be a magic user who demands her life. She trades it for a child, and the child gets locked up in the tower. And the child gets the name of the vegetable. Yeah. But so I rewrote it with the American audience in mind, an adult American audience, and trying to recreate what's a folk tale. Because so for me, the definition of a fairy tale is a story that's written by a person for an audience. And in France, that a lot of that was person was from the courts and was writing for the royal audiences. In Germany, it was a much more democratic audience that they were writing for. But again, they're always, all these stories are written for a particular audience. A folk tale, on the other hand, is a story written by a culture rather than for an audience, because the audience is that culture. And so I wanted to do a Maiden in the Tower that was basically American, you know, all sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And this is what I ended up doing, was telling it to lots of different people over a lot of time, choosing different elements to put together to find how it worked together. And this is the result. So even though a lot of the themes are above your head, at least the word's not inappropriate.
Okay.
That's okay. This is the tale of the sorcerer who wanted to live forever. And he put all his efforts towards that goal. All of his wealth, all of his time was spent traveling to the corners of the earth, looking for the secret of immortality. And he finds it. It's a complex formula, a complicated ritual, when put together, creates an elixir of eternal life. And it's only one problem. The primary ingredient is the blood of a 21-year-old virgin. And in those days, in that place, women were free. They did what they wanted, and most of them had explored life and love long before 21. So it didn't matter how much he offered or even what he offered. There were just no women virgins of that age to be found. And so he put his mind to other things, other ways to get women to do what he wants. And he had some success with puppies. He hybrid some puppies with, merged them in with other household herbs, just common household herbs. And he had some success with a rosemary bush. And since rosemary is both culinary and medicinal, he had no problem getting it into the local markets. Well, a couple of doses of his rosemary zest, and the people would be hooked. They'd be back for more. So very soon, his wealth and his influence spread. Now, one of those people was a young woman. She was a singer of songs, And she had been exploring life and love enough to create a new life to love. And in her pregnancy was experiencing some very strong cravings. And not knowing about the machinations of the sorcerer, she combined a little of his rosemary zest with her meals and found herself with a habit she could not afford on her singer's salary. And one night, sitting up in her apartment, unable to buy that thing she so desired, she suddenly smelled the scent of that herb. And looking out the window, down in the garden next door, she saw, glowing in the moonlight, a beautiful silvery blue rosemary bush. And even though she had heard from her friends that the guy next door was some kind of sexual pervert, she snuck into the garden and broke off a sprig. But there is no sneaking into a sorcerer's garden. He steps out of the shadows before she can reach the gate, and he is angry. "You dare steal from me?" She's afraid. She falls to her knees. "Please, sir, I'm pregnant. I couldn't help myself." Well, the anger drains from him as his opportunity realizes itself. He says, "Pregnant? Oh, I understand. Take all the rosemary you want. But promise me your child, if it's a girl, when she reaches her appropriate age, I'll apprentice her to me. And I promise you, I will protect her reputation, keep her safe, and when she's 21, she'll have a trade." And the woman, thinking herself fortunate, promised her unborn child to the sorcerer and left with a large basket of rosemary. Well, the child was born. It was a girl, and they named her Rosemary after her mother's hook. But little Rosemary, she sang. At first, she cooed the croonings her mother sang at her cradle. And next, she began mimicking her mom backstage as her mother performed. Then she sang any song she heard, no matter who sang it, just plucked it out of the air, first hearing, like magic. After that, she began weaving together words and melodies and ways to create tunes that mesmerized her listeners. And then she turned 7 and started school. And singing her way home from school, she would walk past the sorcerer's house and he would call out the window, "Rosemary, Rosemary, 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 remind your mother of her promise." And so little Rosemary, she would go home to her mom. She'd say, "Mom, that man next door says, remember your promise." And her mother would say, "Just ignore him." But she wasn't ready to give up her child. But that meant every day, as Rosemary sang her way home from school, the sorcerer would call, "Rosemary, remind your mother of the promise." And Rosemary would, and her mother would say, "Ignore him." Until one day she didn't. Might have been the drugs. Might have just been hangry. I don't know. But that day she was beside herself. And she said, "Tell him, just take it." And so the next day, as Rosemary sang her way home from school, the sorcerer called out, "Rosemary!" And she replied, "She says just take it." And he reached out the window and he grabbed the little girl, pulled her in, locked her up in the garret, and he never let her out. But Rosemary sang. She sang every song she'd ever sung and made new songs to sing after that. And the sorcerer began to notice that out in front of his house, out in the street, the people began to gather and listen to Rosemary singing. And he didn't care, because he liked it too. Until she turned 14. And then he began to notice that most of the people out in front of his house listening to Rosemary sing were young men. And that made him nervous, because he still had 7 more years, and he really wanted to live forever. So he conjured a tower far out in the wilderness where no one ever went. It was 70 feet tall, a window way at the top, only way in or out. Then he conjured Rosemary into the tower, and he spelled her hair. It grew long and thick and strong, and they braided it into a rope. And Rosemary would sit in a chair by the window and hook the top of the braid to a hook. drop out the rest whenever the sorcerer would call. Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair. He would scramble up and spend his day working on potions and spells at his sorcerer's workbench and listening to Rosemary sing. He had her all to himself. But as Rosemary grew into her maidenhood, the sorcerer began to have a new problem. You see, his masculine desires began to conflict with his long-term goals, and he realized he couldn't spend so much time alone in the tower with Rosemary. And so he took to coming just once a day, really quick, just arriving early in the morning, calling out, climbing up, leaving her with the things she needed for the day, climbing back down, and he'd be gone. And that, of course, is when the hunter showed up. A young man out in the wilderness looking for some great beast to prove his manhood. He hears the singing in the wind. He follows it back in sight of the tower just in time to see the sorcerer show up. Call out, Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair. Climb up, and a few minutes later he climbs back down and he's gone. And the hunter thinks, I'd like to try that. He goes over to the window and calls, Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair. And Rosemary, thinking it's just the sorcerer back for some reason, drops down the braid. He scrambles up, and wasn't she surprised to see a young man in her window? Well, she's afraid. And he reassures her, please, don't be scared. I heard you singing. It was so beautiful, almost as beautiful as you. Well, flattery will get you far if you're a young man in a young woman's window. So she let him stay. And when he left, she didn't think she needed to tell the sorcerer about him. So he came back, and they became friends, and maybe more than friends, because they began talking about going somewhere else and starting a life far away from towers and sorcerers. And the hunter said, Rosemary, how would you get out of the tower? And she said, that's the easy part. She cut off her braid, tied it to the hook by the window. 1 minute, and she went over to the sorcerer's workbench, and she took out 3 small nuts, about the size of acorns. And she put on each of those nuts, it was carved the face of an animal. The first one was the face of a dog. The second was a lion, and the third was the face of a wolf. And she put those nuts into a pouch on her belt, and she climbed down the braid, and the couple rode off. But there is no sneaking out of a sorcerer's tower. He actually knew the moment she cut off the braid. He came as quick as he could, but by that time, the braid was all that was left. So he climbs up, knowing she's not there, goes over to his workbench, and he takes out his magic eye and his 7-league boots. And going over to the window, he searches the wilderness until he sees the couple. He puts on those 7-league boots, and 7 leagues in every step, he's soon catching up. But Rosemary sees him coming, and she reaches into her pouch, and she pulls out that first nut, the nut with the face of a dog. And she tosses it over her shoulder, and when it lands, up springs a huge bull mastiff with huge jowls and sharp teeth and drool splattering off in every direction. And the dog is growling and fierce, and the sorcerer's trying to deal with that, and he conjures up a flock of birds, which he sends flying at the dog. And as the dog is snapping at the birds, the sorcerer steps around, and with those 7-league boots, he's catching up again. But Rosemary sees him coming, takes out the second nut, the nut with the face of a lion, tosses it over her shoulder. Up springs the lion, but this time the sorcerer is prepared. He conjures up a donkey and throws it straight down the lion's throat, tearing the skin off at the same time. So while the lion is trying to deal with the carcass of the donkey, the sorcerer wraps the skin around himself and disguised camouflage runs off to the side and ahead to set up an ambush for Rosemary. But Rosemary saw him, and she pulled out that last nut, the nut with the face of the wolf. And as the sorcerer was about to pounce, she cast it down at his feet. Up springs the wolf and swallows the donkey skin, sorcerer and all. So he doesn't get to live forever. But Rosemary sings happily ever after.